Okay, thank you everyone for being here tonight. I am Cecilia Koger. I'm the Director of Exhibitions for Angels Gate Cultural Center. Angels Gate Cultural Center is a nonprofit community art center based in San Pedro. We offer community art classes. We host about 50 artist studios. We have an artist in the classroom education program, an art gallery, and in addition to that, we have various contemporary art programming like Studio Soup. So thank you for being with us here tonight. Just a few housekeeping items. You can enable closed captioning if you need that on your device. It's under the More button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. On iPads, it's under the meeting settings. We are not live streaming this event. However, this meeting will be recorded and clips may be used in the future for educational or promotional purposes. If you have any questions in the chat, which I hope you have some really great questions for our guest artist tonight, feel free to pop them in the Q&A feature. So at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen, there is a Q&A button. And if you have any questions, you can pop them there. If you want to chat with us, you can also put comments in the chat as well. But we'll do our best to answer all of the questions in the Q&A feature later on this evening. I'd like to begin our event with a land acknowledgement. Angels Gate Cultural Center is located in San Pedro in the Port of Los Angeles region in California. We recognize that we live and work on the traditional and sacred lands of the Tongva, Kizh, Ahachiman, and Chumash, and the many other indigenous groups who call these grounds home. We at Angels Gate Cultural Center honor and extend our gratitude to all of the original peoples still living in this region. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight for Studio Soup. This is our ongoing virtual series where we interview contemporary artists about their practice. Tonight, we are very happy to have Ben Cuevas and Jynx Prado joining us for this conversation. And I'll tell you just a tiny bit about their practice so you have a little bit of context for the discussion tonight. Ben Cuevas is an artist whose work is rooted in concepts of otherness and intersectionality. Inspired by his queer, non-binary, and Latinx lived experience, Ben seamlessly merges textiles, photography, sculpture, installation, and performance, resulting in art that reclaims both spaces and voices silenced by history. Jynx Prado creates sculptures of mixed fibers and found furniture, embracing gender fluidity and confronting societal preconceptions. Through humor, irony, and symbolism, they create sculptures, performances, and visuals that interweave queerness, their Latinx community, and historical and mythological texts. Both artists bridge the past and present, using their work to foster a new era of intersectional queer culture while inviting viewers to embrace the warmth of human connection. Both Ben and Jynx are currently based and working in the greater Los Angeles area, and I'd like to invite them to turn on their screens and join us for the conversation. So thank you very much, Ben and Jynx, for being with us here tonight. I'm very much looking forward to doing a deep dive into your practice and learning a bit more about each of you. And I kind of want to start us off with a big picture question about origin, your origin story as an artist. So I'm wondering if each of you can share about your creative journey, specifically what led you to becoming an artist. So maybe I'm going to pass that off to maybe Ben first, and then Jynx, if you also want to answer that question as well.
Sure. Well, I feel like I've always been an artist. I can't really pinpoint a time where I wasn't being creative and making things in some way when I was a toddler. And my mom would like put out dinosaur toys for me to play with in this like Play-Doh muck that she helped me make. But in terms of becoming a professional artist, I think it was in in college, where I really made the decision to pursue art professionally. I went to the Whitney Biennial in 2008 with a friend of mine who worked for an artist who had work installed there. And she was giving me a tour of the exhibition and telling me all of the stories about, what the installation process was like. And it just made me realize that like artists are people and I'm a person and I can be an artist. So why not? And I think why not has just kind of been my guiding principle ever since.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jinx, how about you? What do you consider to be your moment? Maybe I like how Ben, you gave us a really specific moment of what kind of inspired you. I'm wondering, Jinx, if you also have a similar moment.
I feel like from when I was a kid, like there'd be times that, like when you look at how kids interact with the world and then you see their interests and it's like, oh, that kid wants to be like an astronomer for sure. That kid wants to be like a doctor for sure. I think that one moment that I had was just like one day, like I wanted to just do something at home and I was just bored. And I decided to just maybe make something like a painting. Like I was just seeing like a bunch of like cool things like in videos at the time, like in YouTube, just people drawing stuff. So I what I did is that like at the age of like 11 or 12, if I remember, like I actually got my scooter and rode to like the nearest Michael's, which was like a good 5 miles from like 4 to 5 miles from my house, like in Hawthorne City, all the way to like this nearest one. And then when I came back and got the stuff, and I kind of thought about it like over the years, like that same story that kind of stuck with me. And I realized that, that moment of just if I had that much commitment to like getting these supplies at that age and committed to wanting to do something like that, I feel like that was like that moment where I started going
Mm-hmm.
into art, just like wanted to express myself in a way and just seeing like how others did it, and it just inspired me to just get off from my seat and pretty much just ride my scooter to like that art store. So that still story still stays with me even
Yeah.
like years later.
Well, you were compelled to source your materials at
Yeah.
age, you said you were 11, doing
11 or 12, I
11
think.
or 12, doing a five
Yeah.
mile bike ride. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I want to circle back to materials because I think both of you use materials in a really interesting way. But before we kind of deep dive into materials, I kind of want to go back to this idea of origin and talk about growing up and maybe talk about maybe your cultural background, because I know that that is something as intersectional artists, that's something that both of you are thinking about in your practice and referencing in different ways. So I'd love to hear about your cultural background and how that played a role in influencing and developing each of you as artists.
Mhm. Um, I feel like for mine, like for my grandma, like when she was a little bit younger, like when I was a kid, she and her sisters would always just like sew fabric together. They'd sometimes be sewing clothes. Like my aunts would usually have a bunch of sewing supplies, sewing kits in their garage. And at one point, they've told me that when they were like before I was born, they would always just gather together and just making clothes or just working together, like in like the household setting and just like having that family connection. And when I was just growing up, as I just got older, like I'd asked my grandma like for some sewing tips on just like how to be able to sew some fabric because there's some cloth I wanted to fix. So she was willing to teach me.
Mm-hmm.
And like with a lot of like the hierarchy of like toxic masculinity, I felt like maybe she wouldn't want to teach me that because like maybe that she would think it'd be weird. Like when I was younger, like she would see me like, oh, like this boy wants to learn how to sew, but she was more than willing to teach. And just like that tradition of just passing down like the type of sewing fabrics like her mother taught her and then she would teach me, and just keeping that tradition from our family, just sewing together these different fabric patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And Ben, how about for you?
Yeah, I feel like my Latinx identity in particular and cultural ethnicity comes through, especially in my solo show from 2019, Queering the Landscape, where I did these like macrame inspired pieces. They're knit, but they have this like macrame aesthetic, which I decided to work with because it's sort of like a local vernacular tradition in Joshua Tree, where I was an artist in residence while I was working on that. But also, I have all of these memories from visiting Puerto Rico as a child and seeing like tons of macrame things in all of the gift shops and in my grandma's apartments, like plantain holders that were macrame, and like I just feel like there's this strong connection there that sort of underpins my affinity for textiles.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you both kind of, especially you, Jinx, you touched on this other aspect to the materials that you use where, fiber and craft are kind of traditionally seen as having a gendered expression to them, like traditionally, right? And both of you are kind of upending that. So I'm curious if you have anything to kind of add to the significance or maybe why you're drawn to these materials and maybe how that's related to you and your practice.
It's kind of a funny story. It's just like with my grandmother and I, like when I started working with the fabrics and experimenting a bit on material, like when I was going from undergrad to grad, I asked her just like, what was the one fabric that you never liked to work with? And then she told me burlap. And
Mm,
then like when she mentioned burlap, I said, why? And then she's like, because it doesn't feel good and like it doesn't always work out like whenever you sew it. And
mm,
that it always reminds me of just all the times from like the family that whenever we'd be back in Mexico, like they would always have like the fabric everywhere. And I'm like, that's interesting because like, like she didn't really talk about her time from Jalisco as much like as us growing up, but that moment for her to like touch into that. So I was curious and just seeing like the vast amount of like the use of burlap over the centuries and then from like agriculture to industrial.
mhm,
And so I started using it as like an industrial type of medium, mixing it with concrete, wood, steel, and just working with it
mhm,
until COVID-19 happened. And that pretty much minimized my working space. And I had to choose like which material that I would use best for my home space. And that was burlap. And I
mhm,
continued using it and using it as my main visual language.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and also this is kind of a tangent, but it's interesting that you mentioned how burlap kind of started in your work. I had maybe this is me injecting my own interpretation, but I always looked at burlap as being like you used it to represent flesh and skin. So I always wondered, was that directly speaking to maybe being uncomfortable and in growing up in these constructs that you were maybe allowed or expected to take on? So it's interesting to hear that it was kind of a direct like, oh well, that is difficult, well I'm going to take on that challenge and use that material and I'm going to use that and incorporate it into my practice. So I think that's kind of interesting that that's how that originated. And then I feel like Ben, you and I, when we had our studio visit, we talked about how there has been a sort of, I don't know if reclaiming is the right term, but there has been a deliberate use of craft and non-traditional materials by the queer artists community. And I'd kind of like to hear your perspective on that and how you see your use of materials, maybe commenting on that.
Sure. I think, as a queer person, working with textile-based media, I think I was never really more aware of my gender or how I was perceived in the world as when I first started knitting in public. Not even doing performance-based work yet, but just working on projects in public at a coffee shop or something. People would like look at you weird, and they'd be like, "Why is this guy knitting?" Or I'd like go into a yarn shop and like the vibe would be like, "Why are you here?" So I was constantly being reminded of, my maleness and how I present to the world, but like how that doesn't really align with how I feel in terms of my own gender identity. Uh, so knitting was a really great way to like reclaim a feminine practice for myself and to express my gender queerness through a physical act that's so coded as feminine in society.
And do you, I guess, kind of going off of that, are there other materials that you use, and this is for either of you, that you feel like is either an act of reclaiming or maybe transformation? I'm curious to hear how this transformation of materials, of taking something that exists for has one set of expectations and upending that, or taking a material and using it in a new context in a new way. I'm very curious to kind of hear about that from both of you.
I think photography can be that for me at times. I feel like photography is very much about the gaze. And when we think of the gaze in society, the predominant gaze is the male gaze, the cis, straight, white male gaze. And I think there's something very empowering in, claiming one's own gaze as a, queer or non-binary or person in the world. So yeah, for me, photography can really be that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, before we kind of, I'm curious to hear about that from you as well, Jynx, but I feel like first I kind of want to go specifically onto the series Reinserted. So we have some photography examples by Ben to show. So I'm wondering, Annie, if you can pull up, yes. So to me, this is very much an act of reclaiming space. So please tell us about this series Reinserted.
Totally. So for this series, I find archival images of sex workers or people cruising for sex in public spaces. And I go to queer archives, LGBTQ archives, to find these images, or work with, queer artists. So this was from the archive of Pat Rocco, who was an Athletic Models Guild photographer in LA in the 50s through 80s. And he did a series of photographs of male hustlers in a notorious cruising area in Hollywood in the 70s, which is what the subject of this photo comes from. So I take the subjects from these historical images and then I digitally reinsert them into a photo that I take in the same location in the present day, doing this sort of act of virtual time travel and reclaiming these spaces. These spaces often have been, changed dramatically from how they were when these photos were originally taken. What was once a place for queer cultural exchange, and now is a space for commerce or a luxury hotel. So these spaces have changed so much, and I think it's so interesting to reclaim and to literally reinsert queerness into these spaces. Like this woman here, she's a trans woman who worked at a peep show in Times Square in the 80s, which now is a Sephora. So these spaces have changed so much, and I think there's power in recentering and reclaiming our histories in these spaces.
Mm. Yeah. And I feel like Jynx, you do some reclaiming when it comes to like mythology or like storytelling in stories. So I feel now there's like two questions on your plate now that I kind of want to get into for you, Jynx. So let's start with maybe how you reclaim and you transform materials, but you also reclaim and you transform stories, like classic stories.
Mm-hmm.
So whichever direction you want to take with that.
So from there's this mini series that I've been working on recently. It's called Query Tales. So it's pretty much just creating like fairy tales, but like in the lens of like a gender fluid or like gender queer type of mindset. Mm-hmm. So if we were to go to, I guess this one, Snow White and the Seven Deadly Sins, like this was pretty much the retelling of like Snow White, And I first started with this one because this was honestly one of those movies where like you were seeing like the most generic storytelling that you can possibly do. It's been reiterated so many different times, along with like stories like Pinocchio or different stories from like Cinderella. But like Snow White was the first one because I felt like I connected to it the most
Mhm.
regarding of just why Snow White was initially taken out by like her crazy stepmother queen. Because in the story it quoted that she was taken out because she was the fairest of all. And I was thinking of that as like for those who are genderqueer, who are trans, currently right now in the United States, where a lot of us are seen as targets for a lot of anti-trans, anti-queer laws to be implemented. And the only reason why so many folks tend to engage in that and to try to remove our rights is because we're just existing.
Mhm.
Snow White was taken down with a poison apple because she was the fairest. She was just existing, being herself. She wasn't causing any harm. She wasn't really going into any tangent into saying that she's the most beautiful. She was pretty much like herself. So I felt like for those who are trans and genderqueer, we needed a story to be looked at in a way that it could reflect our type of experience. So what I did is that I recreated the scene and put myself in the position of Snow White and just pretty much laid on this fabricated bed that I made out of used furniture and scrapped up wood and creating this whole entire Snow White bed system and just laid there for 8 hours straight awake and laying flat on this board, which mind you was honestly very uncomfortable for like 8 hours straight, 5 times doing that, like 40 hours. That's like a working week of doing that. And
Wow.
just, yeah, being awake the entire time. Like someone told me, like, why didn't you sleep like how Snow White did? And I'm like, because there's a lot of trans and genderqueer people who are going through it right now, and it's for the folks that who cannot like lay in peace, knowing that their lives are pretty much targeted.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that it's interesting that you very literally made yourself the subject to share your and others'
Mm-hmm.
experiences, kind of
Yeah.
navigating this. I'm curious, when you were in this space, kind of embodying your
Mm-hmm.
piece as yourself, how did you like kind of live in that space for 8 hours a day for a whole week? That to me, that sounds very not only physically painful but also mentally
Mm-hmm.
painful. And I guess because that's something that in your space you're kind of used to dealing with this on a certain level, right? So how are you able to kind of be and exist in that space and kind of live this performance and not go crazy, essentially, kind of embodying this idea and embodying this reality?
Uh, Sorry, like earlier you saw like my cat pass by from the screen.
That's all right.
Like I said, like she was gonna wreak havoc somehow.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. Like, what was the second half of the question?
I'm just curious, like where when you were kind of living this performance piece.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this also kind of goes for both of you because Ben also you also have a performance practice and you have some history of doing some performance as well.
Mm-hmm.
As performance artists, how do you sort of how are you able to embody those themes that you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
portray in the piece and do it in a way that you can kind of mentally recover from that?
Mm-hmm.
Is doing that performance, is it a form of catharsis? Is it a form of meditation? I'm just very curious about how performance artists are able to live in that space.
Mm-hmm. It was kind of more like a therapeutic, but in the same time, it was like that moment of thinking that where a lot of people tend to have, but like in the situation that I have, a lot of people would usually think to themselves alone, but like in my situation, like to put in perspective of where this was shown in the Cerritos College gallery window side. So I'm pretty much like in this giant glass box, like
Mhm.
how Snow White would be like in this giant glass like container. But what was interesting was like while I was laying down, there would always be folks passing by and seeing me from that and just seeing me be present at the space. And, just either if I'm presenting myself very feminine, if I'm presenting myself in any other way, the one thing that I always focus on in my work is just like how individuals look at a certain body and how they determine it, how they describe it.
Mhm.
So for me, just laying down at that moment, being vulnerable and just putting myself in that position of being stared at, looked at, and just like inspected by like these random people of who I would have no clue of whether or not they'd be those that would either be against from what I want to do or those who are for what I want to do. It pretty much gave me those moments of just like that self therapy of like that exposure therapy, I guess.
Mhm.
But it also like gave me more of like in that empowerment of like keeping up with like the routine of like laying down in that space and just knowing that like mentally I could go through this. I've gone through this every single day, going out dressed the certain way that I do or presenting myself the certain way that I do. And I could go through this too. So it's just like keeping myself up, keeping myself amped up in a way.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, well, to me that seems like it was probably, at least from my perspective, I interpret it as a very charged piece because you the artist, you're there in your body, in your form, kind of embodying all these ideas, and kind of transitioning to Ben. I feel like you also have some bodies of work that are very like confrontational, but also humorous in a way. So I'd actually kind of like to explore maybe some of those confrontational works in pieces and maybe talk about them. I'm thinking about like your tweetables are very confrontational, or if you have other works that you want to talk about that we can kind of pull up that have that same sort of level of confrontation.
Absolutely. I mean, thinking about performance-based work too, and hearing about Jinx's piece where Jinx was like there for an entire work week. I similarly did a performance piece where I was in a gallery for an entire work week performing. It was called Man's Body, Woman's Work, and I sat nude in the gallery and knit myself like a full flesh-colored, degendered bodysuit from start to finish over the course of a work week, commenting on the like absurdity of why do we consider one body a man's body, why do we consider one type of work woman's work. I think there's a lot of absurdity there. And yeah, the same kind of confrontational absurd humor factors into my tweetables pieces too. I did these pieces, they're a series of wall hangings that are knit text in 140 characters or less. And a lot of the inspiration for it comes from queer culture and internet culture, riffing on, like an aspect of like gay dating apps here, where you'll often see like people saying no fats, no femmes, discriminating against fat people or femme people on dating apps, and me saying no, thank you. Like that is not what I am here for. So yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just wanted to. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, Jinx.
Yeah, I think some of the work is in the slides too, but like I had stretched small burlap pieces too that also have like those type of similar texts as well, but like it's
Love it.
different. Like, yeah, yeah, there
Wonderful.
they are.
Yes. I
So,
did want to notice how both of you use language. Yes. And for
mhm.
Ben, it's in your tweetables that have a bit of humor. And Jinx, I feel like you also incorporate humor. To me, this is kind of like a dark humor or a dark, or right? Am I reading that,
Mhm.
interpreting that correctly? Um,
Yeah.
and it is kind of jarring and it is confrontational to see like this. It's kind of hard to read this text. I don't want to misread it,
Mhm.
but I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, but it says beard and a dress, correct?
Yeah, like the whole title it says "ha ha ha" beard and a dress. So like
Mm-hmm.
with the idea of like the dark humor, it is pretty much like a dark humor type of piece, but what it is, it's like I've mentioned before, like where there'd be like that discomfort of people staring and like looking and just like the way how I dress or how I present myself.
Mhm.
Well, the type of stares that I usually get, they'd be like very varied. So like some people would just be like a more like hysterical type of stare. They'd be more like a menacing type of stare, confused type of stare. I would mimic those stares and like draw my own eyes over like some of these texts. And some of these texts would be like the things that I hear. Sometimes from the back of my ear, I would hear it from the room. I would hear it about somebody else. And then just like more of like reclaiming those words and reclaiming of just like that moment of just like being ridiculed. It's kind of like that mocking type of joke. It's like, oh, you look ugly. And then the other person's like, oh, you look ugly. Like that type of thing, like
Mhm.
just going back at them, jabbing back like the same type of words, but just kind of like in a mocking humor kind of way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Are these eyes, are these modeled off of your own, or are any of these self-portraits in a way, or are these other figures that you're kind of referencing?
Mhm. Yeah,
Both.
it'd be like a self portrait. Like these are my eyes. And like I would usually just like every time, like I would just look at a mirror and just like making these different expressions, which is funny because like it is kind of like also a performative type of thing. Like I feel like I engage my work often like in a performance,
Mhm.
whether it be like making the sculptures out of my own body form and
Mhm.
just like measuring and making my own poses for that, or just drawing my own expressions and just like making a character at that moment to fit like the text. Like I feel like that was pretty much like a back thought, honestly. Like now
Mhm.
realizing it really is kind of interesting. Kind of translates in that performance aspect.
Mhm. I wonder if there's sort of this confrontation that both of you are using in performance or in some of these pieces with language. Do both of you feel sort of like, what draws you to kind of be direct, I guess, in your interaction with the viewer? It's like you are eliciting a very direct and visceral response in some of these works. And I'm curious if the interest is in creating that response from the viewer, kind of eliciting an emotion, or if maybe that's sort of like a byproduct of your interest in, using interesting language or dark humor.
Well, for me, I think it comes from like my connection to queer activist communities. I think being so engaged in, activism around HIV, and also feeling like my work is really connected to like a lineage with like ACT UP and various activist groups. I think it is that sort of, activist impetus to
Mhm.
disrupt and to cause change. So I think that's where it comes from in my work.
Mhm. And Jinx, do you feel the same for you? Is it coming from an activist standpoint or more of an autobiographical kind of
I would
place?
say both. I feel like presenting my autobiography of like my life into the work is kind of like an activist point of view, like I'm pretty much living the situation that I advocate for. And what I'm advocating for is just for me to exist and for our stories to be told, regardless of like how minimum those stories can be. Especially like growing up, like there wasn't really much of like gender queer culture as much presented in cultural media than it is now. Like even like when I was in high school, like the non-binary flag itself wasn't even like created till like 2014. That's
Mhm.
like the time I graduated high school. So like that's crazy to think about. Even though like non-binary identities and genderqueer identities were like culturally there, like in different cultures and religion, like points like where it's told like in the back door of it, but like worded differently. But we knew that it was talking about gender queerness. But
Mhm.
now it's just like it's more open to discuss. And now when some people feel like they're threatened with these type of stories being told, making anti-trans, anti-queer laws and censoring it out in schools, censoring out in different institutions, like I felt like it was my obligation to tell my story and for it to like be a part of that surface so it could continue.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
when both of you are talking about telling stories, I really think about then your piece, Ghosts of the Trucks of the West Side Highway. To me, that piece kind of embodies this idea of being an activist and telling stories. I'd love to hear more about this piece in particular.
Sure. So this piece was created for an exhibition of queer installation art in West Hollywood called Install WeHo, and all of the artists were given U-Haul trucks to install their work in for the show. And I really wanted to do something site-specific to the site of a truck that was connected to ideas around queerness and identity. And so I turned to the history of around the time of gay liberation in the 70s, when men would go cruising in trucks that were parked along the West Side Highway in New York's meatpacking district. They were left; these meatpacking trucks were left empty at night, and gay men and women and lesbians too would go and have sex inside of these trucks, and it was a wonderful, celebratory, liberatory, radical act of reclaiming public space for queerness and queer sexual expression. And so I wanted to honor that history and sort of conjure the ghosts from that time in this work. So I invited a group of people to have sex inside of a U-Haul truck, and then recorded the audio from that. And then during the installation, that audio played on hidden speakers, so you could hear the auditory phantoms of adult acts that were taking place in the trucks. And inside the truck, I hung this photograph by Leonard Fink of gay men cruising outside of the trucks in the 70s. And I printed it on this gauzy translucent fabric that sort of blew in the breeze, so it had this kind of ghostly quality to it, and conjuring queer ancestors from years past.
Mm-hmm. I also feel like another body of work that kind of makes me think of sort of ghosts, or kind of think about some other things that are maybe more difficult to deal with, is I'm thinking about your pills series. And what I particularly love is that they're very playful, and that you have people kind of interacting, and sort of like your current exhibit, you invited people to put on suits and get in the pillow and in the knit sculptures. But to me, this is kind of playful, but it also is kind of dark in a way too. So I'd love to hear about this piece and how it kind of, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a heaviness to it. It's about HIV and treating HIV, and so these pills are all this pillows installation that I made is comprised of pills that I've taken in the course of treating my own HIV. And I really wanted to create a space where people could feel comfortable talking about treatment as prevention, or talk about pre-exposure prophylaxis, which some of these pills can be taken for that as well, which are ways of preventing HIV transmission. I feel like there's a lot of taboo around stuff that has to do with sex and sexuality, and I really wanted to cut through that by literally inviting people to get very comfortable in a space where they could think about these things and talk about these things in a public way.
Mm-hmm. And then you have a series too. I'd love to see the other image of the smaller pill sculptures too. Yeah, so you have a series of these smaller. I feel like these also have another meaning, because you incorporate some additional language, like you have Gilead on this piece. Maybe talk about how this kind of has some additional context and some additional meaning behind this series.
Sure. So this piece is called Knit Prep, and it's a Truvada pill, which has been taken for pre-exposure prophylaxis to prevent people from contracting HIV if they're, at risk. Gilead is the manufacturer of the pill, and I really wanted to, represent the pill as it was. So that's why it has 701 and Gilead on it there. That's what's actually imprinted on the pill itself.
Mm.
And this piece was part of a series of called Play Smart trading cards, which Visual Aids, which is a really awesome organization that champions the work of HIV positive artists. And they put together a series of cards that have safer sex practices, and artists contribute work to each card. So they assigned me the card for PrEP, for pre-exposure prophylaxis, and that's where this pill came about. And I have a series of some other pills as well, which are in medicine cabinets.
Mhm.
Yes, those here. So these are, I knit the 5 most popular psychoactive drugs at the time of making this. And then I put them in medicine cabinets that I turned into these display cases that you see here.
Mhm. It's interesting seeing pills and medicine and these loaded things kind of being knit in like this soft, beautiful, sculptural, tactile form. And what I find really interesting is when you knit and do this with body parts and like intestines, and maybe this would be a good transition to kind of show those pieces from this body of work. I just think that it's so interesting to see something that is kind of like gross in a way, like an intestine isn't a pretty thing, and yet you kind of knitted it in this soft, beautiful form, and it's really interesting to look at, and it's such an interesting dynamic to see that. And I'm curious if we can maybe talk about this series. I think it's called The Hospital Room, where you have the different intestines, yes, kind of splayed out. And I'm very curious to learn about this body of work.
Yeah, so in the hospital room here, I knit the 7 parts of the body that correspond to the chakras. So I view knitting as a very meditative practice, and I wanted to represent a form that kind of spoke to that. So that's where the idea for knitting chakras came from. And I was also really interested in representing the inside of the body in a material we usually associate with going outside of the body. I'm very interested in like pairing of opposites and dialectics, and so that's something I wanted to play with in this work, and also the pairing of like hard and soft. Like this piece was kind of born out of my frustrations of dealing with the medical industrial complex and feeling like, you know, going into a clinical setting, it's this very sterile, and which, you know, it's good that it's sterile, but it's also like cold and uninviting, and it can make you feel, you know, disconnected and dissociated from the body. And so that's why that's paired with this very, you know, soft and more comforting aspect of the body itself. Sort of pairing those opposites of hard and soft, or cold and warm, or male or female even. The piece here that you see that references the second chakra, which is all about creative energy, and corresponds to the genitals. I merged male and female genitalia into that one piece. Or sorry, I should use different language about that. Phallus and vulva is a better language to use, because, you know, who's to say what is male or female genitalia? But yeah, I didn't want to privilege any one gender over another, so I combined them together in that piece.
Mm-hmm. I didn't even realize that. That's really interesting to hear that you kind of merged, and you have other pieces that do that. We saw earlier the masculine, feminine, like joint knit sculpture that kind of, yes, that brought the 2 forms together. So this kind of goes back to, you know, this concept of non-binary, and kind of looking at how this is kind of infused throughout work for both of you, really. And I'm curious, Jynx, like for you, what pieces do you feel like kind of reference that same thing of the non-binary and the slippage or the merging? I'm curious to see what pieces kind of speak to that very directly for you.
in the slides, there's a piece that's called I am them and they as I. It's like that one big sculpture. Yeah, that one. That
Mhm,
one was actually more of a merge of like different body parts. So like it's like a woman's breast, masculine chest, and just like the casual like stereotypical like type of characteristics of what you see from a male and female, but like mixed, and just
mhm,
trying to merge it to make the middle, but also the outside. Like when
mhm,
I made that piece, I was just thinking of just like what kind of position would I want it to be, like where it could reference some kind of like position of like how we're thinking of like statues and bodies. And I thought of like the statue of David, where like that one is like the contrapposto and just the way like that male gaze was just there of like the perfect body where I'm just like using my own body. I'm just like, well, I just try to make it where I just mix it up and where I'm seeing like this is my body that I'm seeing that it's like it's a good body.
mhm,
And I created it just with those mixed elements.
mhm,
So there's like some kind of coverage in the bottom too with the flowers. So like there's no determination of like what kind of genitalia there's present, but like you would know that it would supposed to be there, but the flowers are covering it. The whole entire figure in itself is just like the reference of like I am God, or like of the idea of like, oh, like I think, therefore I am. But
mhm,
now I just worded it as like I am them and they as I, just like the aspect of like, oh, like what is this like identity of like if you think of a certain way, then are you that?
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of your sculptures, you are building this human form or
Mm-hmm.
human appearing form. And then some of them, the forms are more explicit than the others. Do you feel like those forms, those bodies are self-portraits, or are you kind of using them to talk about maybe others or a sense of otherness, perhaps?
It could be both, like pretty much just using my body for reference that sometimes I would adjust into fixing into the sculptures to make it more different from what is needed. But it's also in a way for people to see the body and then not to think of a determination of like what it is exactly, but thinking more of themselves. Like that's pretty much the one thing that I want for people to think about when they see my work is like not of seeing like, oh, is it a male? Is it a female? Is it this? Is it that? I would want them to think about their own body form. How do they think of themselves and how do they position themselves in the world? And just seeing like how they can look at bodies differently instead of it having to be labeled. And we could just use like a body expression, like with this piece right here of just like contemplating. Like at the time when it was made, this was like the very middle of like the first year of COVID-19. So like, people were just at a moment like where every single choice was a decider of like whether or not you'd be safe or not. But then it was also like at the same time, I was going through a lot of issues with myself, just my gender identity, where when I wasn't really around anybody, I was having the thoughts more to myself and then just having like that realization where I would always dress a certain way or act a certain way to please others, but I've never been able to give myself comfort. So like this piece was one of the first few sculptures like where it kind of is closest to like what I'm working on now of like form, but as well as just like talking about how does one look at themselves, how does one think about themselves, and how does one reflect their own world.
Mm. And I have to say with this piece especially, and you do it with a lot of your work, is you incorporate the furniture and the hard elements. And with that piece, I love that you cut the chair
Yeah.
in half, right? And then you flipped it. So again, you're taking a single chair and you're splitting it into two and then reversing a part of it. So I'm curious on what attracts you to some of the materials that you're including in your sculpture.
Well, the funny thing is that this sculpture was one of the first where I started using a lot of furniture, but it was more like a happy accident moment because it was like when I had my studio back in Wilmington with Slanguage Studio,
Mhm.
and that I was just looking for furniture like in the streets to see if I could fix up for my studio space because I needed a chair. And that one day I drove by this railway and it had this wooden chair and it looked so beautiful. I'm just like, oh, this is a really cool chair. Like I'm gonna have it in my studio space. So
Mhm.
then I brought it to the space and I wanted to sit on it to see like how it feels like in the space. When I sat on it, it split in half, like in a 2/3 cut, and it was a perfect cut too. So I'm like, this is crazy. Like it was a perfect split. Either erosion was making it like so weak that the wood just split in it, or it was just dumb luck. So there's actually some images that are in my archives where I just have myself playing with the chairs, like where I'm laying it on the floor, sitting down with it, putting it against the wall, experimenting on like how I can play with these chairs. And then I figured, why not use these chairs on some of my burlap sculptures as like armatures instead of using just like that casual wooden cross or like the wooden staff, like where you'd usually see a lot of these type of sculptures, like scarecrow-esque looking sculptures be hoisted on.
Mhm.
And I just experimented on like the way of how it could be presented. And when I was thinking of like how to put the chair together, I thought it would be a unique way to flip it, where it gives like the person discomfort where it's a chair that you're supposed to sit on, but it's a really deformed chair. And it's like you approach it differently and you have different thoughts about it. So it's like, is it a chair that you can't sit on, that you could sit on? And when I realized how these discussions can happen, I continued using like furniture in different ways. More or
Mm.
less, it was also just good dialogue to talk about like the Los Angeles landscape, especially where I live, like in Southeast LA. Like a lot of the communities here, like there's always furniture like found and like in the streets, and people always have like different furniture that is either like withered away with like different mark making, very old style looking furniture. Like you don't really see like the very like expensive type, and like you just see like more of like these wooden crafted type of chairs, like where like it's like it looks like a unique one of a kind. And I just thought it was just an amazing element for storytelling, and it gives such more uniqueness to the
Mhm.
sculpture, but it's not like specific designed. So it's just like it gives it like its own story too. The
Mhm.
possibilities of like who owned the chair. Like I have no idea who owned the chair before I did, but all I know is that it was a very well designed chair and it looked homemade, honestly. And that I had no idea how I even got to like a railroad side. But like now it's just like in possession of like my work. So it's just crazy to think about, to theorize too.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you were drawn to it as like a formal sculptural element in your work. And it's interesting that it's used in such a formal way to kind of add structure and complement your piece. And I think that's really interesting. I also think it's interesting how both of you have very different bodies of work, like you each have series of work. And I feel like for me, what was really interesting when looking at both of you was I looked at Ben, and your recent body of work is very formal and reductive, and you are really taking it to a much more reduced place, not in meaning, but in your formal elements and the visual elements. So I'm wondering if we can pull up the image that shows your current show that you currently have up at yeah, there we go, at Studio 203. I feel like I'm very curious to learn how you kind of pivoted and went in this direction, Ben, of being reductive and formal.
Absolutely. Well, it all kind of came from the genesis of the idea originally, which was this idea of knitting the word non-binary in binary code, this like pairing of opposites right there in the kernel of the idea. And I was thinking too of my previous work and my masculine feminine piece, how that piece was talking about abstract ideas around gender, and used a more abstract formal composition, with the patchwork, and I was thinking, abstraction is a good way to talk about abstract concepts, and gender identity can get a little abstract sometimes. So I decided to move in this very abstract, minimal direction with this work, while still speaking to ideas of gender and, and transcending one's own gender, and ideas of the sublime come up too. I think when you're dealing with the grid or white paintings, which are these referencing the work of Agnes Martin, who her work is very much about the sublime and transcendence. So yeah, that's kind of the kernel of the idea behind this work here. And everything that you see on the pieces on the walls is the same textile that the pillows are made out of too. So it's very much about blurring distinctions between art and craft, or like an object that has utility versus something that goes on the wall and we consider as art. Like why can't a pillow be art? And people are also invited to put on these plain white sort of genderless bodysuits and lounge in the central installation and become part of the work too, further blurring distinctions between the viewer and the art itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to kind of put out there to the audience that if you do have any questions for the Q&A, we're going to get to them here pretty soon. But I kind of want to ask some, and we have been talking about some big picture things throughout the course of this conversation, but I kind of want to gear it towards, I want to go back to this question of audience engagement or viewer engagement. This piece specifically is making me think about that because you did have some suits up and people dove into those pillows and lounged, and it was very playful and fun. But there's also this sort of bigger conversation, much more serious conversation that's happening in your work, in both of your works, in your various series. And I'm curious, what do you hope is the impact, or what's the desired impact, or what's the hope for viewers that encounter your work?
For me, I mean, my hope is that they think a little bit more deeply about whatever I happen to be touching on in any given piece, be it, gender or the body or medicine. Yeah, I just want to give people space to an invitation to think about these things a little more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say for me, it'd be a similar answer too, but I also feel like I would just want people to think about their own perspective of their body, as well as just thinking about where they place themselves as in their body and if whether or not they feel like they could. Like, I would want people to feel valid for that. Especially when I was like younger, I wasn't exposed to like this much type of media or artwork or any type of like visuals that would give me validation for that. Like, just for me to have like some kind of position like there where I could think and have that permission to think about it, and then to look at the artwork and to look at it and know that the artist wants me to think about it, where I would be giving that opportunity for the artist to allow like the audience to be a part of that. And also like to just look at the artwork and probably like for those who can relate to probably like give a little laugh, for those who can feel like they are being heard, and especially for those who want to see this type of work but haven't been able to before, and then to actually be exposed to that, like exposure to like those stories.
Mm-hmm. Where do you each kind of see your role, or how do you view your role, if you feel like you do have a role in this larger conversation that's happening right now? I mean, I feel like the conversation of gender nonconformity is finally at the forefront of public awareness, and it's finally something that's being talked about in regular households, probably not all, to varying degrees, but in many, this is something that is finally in public awareness. And how do you view your role or your place within that conversation?
I'd probably say like my role would be more of like one of those of the starting point, like the thinker, like where like not like the sculpture thinker, but like more or less just those who are pointing at things for people to think about, as
Mhm.
well as just for those posing these questions, a
Mhm.
questioner kind of, because a lot of these things like they're not as seen in media like very quite often like years back, but now like as they're exposed now, how do we treat them? And like how do we avoid abusing them? How do we avoid them to be censored again? Because like with all these laws coming up, and I always bring them up, especially like in California, because like a lot of people that I talk to would usually say that we're safe here in California because it's a very democratic or like a very much more pro queer type of space. But like a lot of these people are pretty much seeing the picture differently, especially if they're not part of our community, where
Mhm.
I'm posing these questions of like, are we safe? And it's like, should we actually think that we're all right? And then for me to bringing these stories out in my perspective to showing like, no, like we got to double think, like we got to be more precautious and figuring out how do we stay safe, as
Mhm.
well as being able to express ourselves.
Mhm. How do you feel about that, Ben? Do you feel like, you know, do you feel like you have a role or a place, or maybe maybe it's not fair to expect a role, right? That's another perspective, is to expect those who are um disadvantaged, right, or who have faced discrimination. So that's a whole other topic that we could get into, but I'm just curious on your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I do have a role in the cultural conversation of the moment around non-binary identity and queerness. And I think that role for me is kind of twofold. For one, it's the role of teacher. It's to teach through making visible my own embodied experience in the world. And then I think the other part of that is just the role of being seen, being visible and present, and showing up and like asserting my non-binariness in the world. I think in and of itself is can be a radical act when you're doing it in a world that is in so many ways telling you that you can't be this. To stand up and say I am this, I think is in a very important role unto itself.
Mm-hmm. And what do you have for people like me who I am heteronormative, and for people who desire to be an ally or desire to kind of be aligned? What what advice do you have for people like me and maybe some of our viewers here today? How can we better support you all in this community?
Call reps in other states. You can call, jurisdictions and states that you're and districts that you're not part of, and you can tell their elected officials in those states that you do or don't support various issues because you have friends and loved ones in those communities. So those calls really do get recorded, and the officials do take those things into account. So you're not just screaming into the void when you do that. It is one really great concrete way of helping affect change.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a really great concrete, actionable steps for all of us to take, which is, I think, very helpful. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jynx, or if you feel like.
I would say like being able to give the opportunity, like pretty much you're doing that right now, just allowing people like us to be able to express ourselves and then to tell our stories, as well as just to hear us out as well, because like there's a lot of people who tend to not hear about some of these issues because they may feel uncomfortable about it, like not because of them being involved, but more or less because sometimes there's just some people who just don't feel comfortable just hearing about all these politics and saying like, oh, this is like something where it's like heavy handed and like I don't know if I would want to hear it. And it's like, you know, the more people who hear about it, the more awareness that there will be, subconsciously or not. especially nowadays, like where the effort to like censor it is really going upheave. Like there's over 400 anti-laws already like in Congress, like being proposed to pass. And then I believe a good 60 passed in different parts of the US. And now there's even some here in California. So it's like, just being aware of these things going on, spreading word about it for
Mhm.
those who are unaware, and especially being willing to hear about it.
Mhm. Yes, thank you for providing, your perspective, and thank you both for being very candid and honest and telling us about your art. I feel like that's the power of art, is to tell stories in a different way that's not just telling, but engaging the viewer, engaging the audience, getting us to think differently and view differently and just see another perspective, and ultimately have empathy, I think, which is really, really important, of course. I think if there are any questions, I think now is the time to kind of post them in the Q&A. I know that we did get a chat. So if our Q&A facilitator, Annie, if you want to maybe give us some questions or comments that you got tonight.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation to listen in on here. Personally, I really appreciated what you said about just the way that anyone who is queer, like just being yourself and being visible and putting the stuff that you make out there, that is such a radical act, and that's so important. It's what we're here to do. So I really appreciate you both sharing with us tonight. We have one question that we have is, you mentioned the way that your performance work, and that some of the work that is work that you're putting together in your studios, that a lot of it just kind of happens because of like coincidences or things that like you happen to find people coming along during performances or during interactive works. I was wondering if you have any stories of like maybe an interesting or funny or touching moment that you might have had with someone because of this audience interaction.
I think for one I could tell was like for the Snow White and Seven Deadly Sins piece that I made, was that one day, like when I was doing the piece, I was just laying down like all casual. And like when you go to like the UK and then you go to like the King's Castle and you're seeing like all the guards just like standing and then someone's like trying to make a joke, trying to make them laugh. Well, that pretty much happened where I was just laying down. And it's kind of weird, like when you're looking into space for like a very long time up in the ceiling, everything else in the corners kind of blur. So then, like, someone was just doing those faces at the window side. And it's like a good 2 feet away from like where my face is at. So I'm seeing a blob, like just going like this, like making faces. And then, like, my eye kind of like realized something's going on. So, like, I kind of turned it like this. And then someone said, "Oh, damn, it's real." And like, they didn't know that I was a real person, like, just laying down there because I guess I was just so still. Like they just thought I was like some weird, very clever wax sculpture. And then they just panicked. And then it's just like it made me realize like how my body became an object at that moment, but then it became animated once I moved my eye. And that made the response for the viewer just being like, oh, like now I can't stare because they're staring back at me. And it kind of made me realize just like the power of like the eyesight of just like looking at an individual and taking awareness of that. And it's like the moments that people look and engage at a body when they're not looking versus when the body has taken your attention.
That's great.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing that. Ben, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I did a performance piece called Jock Strap where I sat nude in a locker room and knit myself a jock strap from start to finish. And I think I was just touched by how long some of the people who came to see that piece sat with me for. There were some people who sat there for, like 2, 3, 4 hours with me. And I don't know, it was just so meaningful to know that they were engaging with what I was doing and thinking about the absurdity of gender and how do we transcend various lines of gender along with me.
That is wonderful. Thank you. We have another question. Thank you for sharing your words and experiences through creative means. Do either of you find inspiration from cultures other than your own, whose mythologies have queer or two-spirit figures?
I would say for me, like the type of cultures that I was really keen to since I was a kid was like Greek Roman culture, because a lot of like the art from it like shows a lot of queerness in it, and it's kind of funny nowadays. Like there's a lot of very masculine men, like, oh yeah, the Romans, like they're freaking all buff and like hardcore, and then it's just like they're always trying to make it like so masculine, but then it's like the other side of the story. It's like a lot of them were very queer. Like a lot of them were very much more in love with each other, like all the men in Greek and Roman mythology. And just seeing like a lot of these stories where it wasn't really focusing on that, but it was more and less just focusing on just that moment now, like their missions, their stories of like their adventures, but like not really much of their identity. And at that moment, I realized this is pretty much what straightness is like, because like you don't really think of much of an individual when they're straight. It's just like, oh, like how do they live their life differently? A lot of the social norms, it's like they live the normal life, they're just a straight individual, or they're just an individual. But once when you put yourself and you show yourself in the world that you're queer, people think of you differently. People look at you as just queerness. They don't look at you as just Jinx or look at you as just Ben. And it's just like that made me very interested into like exploring how do these stories get told, and then they look at it at that different point of view, even though like I myself I'm aware of that there is a lot of queer culture that is referenced nowadays based on Greek and Roman cultures.
And then do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm also very into Greco-Roman mythology and culture. It's kind of like the basis of my understanding of storytelling and how we still tell stories in this world. But as far as pulling from cultures other than my own, the only time I can really think of when I did it like explicitly in my work was when I was working with the idea of the chakras and the body, that coming from Eastern philosophies. But I think that's a very like open cultural practice. And that's something I try to be conscious of, is like only engaging with practices from other cultures that are open practices. And otherwise pulling from my own cultural experience in the world. And to kind of staying in my lane in that way.
I like the way you put that. I think especially the fact that you both said you draw from your own cultural and family background like as the basis for how you started working with fibers and doing like sewing and macrame. I think that's so interesting. So thank you for sharing. And we had a comment from Anne that said, I love the West Side Highway piece. I had a studio in the meatpacking district in the early 80s around the corner from Star Trek Moving and Storage, where my husband worked. It was some of their empty trucks. I thought that was so interesting.
That's amazing. I love that. Very cool.
I love hearing when you were talking about the Ghosts of the West Side Highway piece, the just the queer history that you learn and kind of inject into your work. And I'm curious about to hear more about the way that you've worked with queer artists and with archivists, and if there's anything else kind of surprising or interesting that either of you have learned and want to share from that kind of research, I guess.
Well, for me, I mean, I'm just a total nerd and I love spending time just poring over stuff in archives. I mean, there's no greater pleasure to me than going to an archive and saying, I need to find images of sex workers and people cruising in public, and then somebody handing me a big box full of media that I can go through and pour over. Like, it is just so fun. And also getting to work with artists too who I've looked up to for a long time. I got to work with the artist Annie Sprinkle, and I got to work with her archive in the Reinserted series. And yeah, it's just incredible to be able to work with people who you really admire and to collaborate across years and generations. I think is a really, really cool thing to be able to do.
Thank you. Jynx, do you have anything you want to add?
I would say that I think in my own experience from like that research based type of work, I'd say like when it came to a lot of the stretched burlap pieces, like the small frame with the quotes, I honestly don't even have a name for that series. Well, I call it the Stair series, but like I feel like it would need to be renamed because like there's like different pieces I have that involve staring as well. But like there is a lot of times that I would be looking at different ways of like how pro queer posters were made, like back in the 80s and 90s, and like all the color pop from that in the past, and just seeing like how I could be able to like reflect a lot more like in today's contemporary times of just how in a way these Stare series are like the advocacy posters, like how it's just like taking like the big bolded words be be gay today, like that type of thing, but like twisting it and using like the words that a lot of homophobic people and transphobic people would use, and just like kind of using the words back at them. So like I feel like in that moment, like it was just a good experience and just like seeing like a fun experimental way, like how I could try to translate that in today's age.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I love those additional questions, Annie. Thank you for facilitating that. That was such an interesting talk, and I want to thank both of you for again sharing your work and allowing us some of your time. And I just want to tell everyone how thankful I am for you all for being here and for listening to this conversation. Again, as you both have iterated, it's very important to listen to these stories. So thank you so much for sharing. If you want to see this conversation again in the future, as I mentioned, we are recording it, so we will be posting this Studio Soup on the website. But again, just thank you both very much. That was such a great conversation. And I do want people to be able to learn more about you. I'm wondering if each of you can maybe share where else people can see your work, maybe what you have coming up or going on right now.
So for me, like I actually have some work up in my hometown in Southgate's art museum right now, in the Southgate Art Gallery. A lot of it actually shows a lot of my development and progress works. It's like a lot of sketches and images, including like some of the chair play that I took photos of. So you get to see like some of the progress of like how I'm making the pieces individually. And I also have a show for the SERB annual up in Arts and Blue Roof that's going to be opening up October 7th, that I'll be showing some of the queer retail pieces at. And I've been co-curating a show at the Long Beach Museum of Art, and that's going to be opening October 6th.
Wonderful. As for me, I have a solo show up right now at a gallery here in LA called Studio 203. And that work is going to be up until January if you want to go check it out. I also have work opening in a show at Bohm Gallery at Palomar College that opens next month. And then later in January, I have work in a show in Breckenridge, Colorado at the Breckenridge Art Center. And I'll be giving a talk there as well. So if you happen to be in the Colorado area, Denver area, you can catch my work there.
Well, thank you again so much. What an interesting conversation. I do think you both have given me some new things to think about, and I definitely feel like I learned some new things from this. If anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about Angels Gate and other talks and programs that we have just like this. Maybe Annie, if you want to share some things that we have coming up at Angels Gate Cultural Center.
Definitely. So the next thing that we have coming up is the Many Winters Gathering of Elders. It's going to take place October 12th through the 15th. And that's a 4-day event where we invite the Indigenous community to come together and share culture and ceremonial practices, and the public is invited to come and learn and listen and observe. So that is a super exciting thing that this will be the second year that we're doing it again after COVID. And so it's really exciting to be able to welcome everyone back. And on that first evening of the gathering, we're going to have the opening reception for our show Red Earth Gaze, which is curated by Gloria Sanchez. And it will be a show of contemporary Indigenous artists sharing about past and future and present. So we're super excited for those events. And then on December 2nd, we'll have Open Studios Day, which is when the Angels Gate Cultural Center studio artists will open their studios, and you'll have the opportunity to go into people's studios and see what they're working on and buy art directly from artists. And so all three of those events coming up, and we have more, so definitely check out our website, follow us on Instagram, and you can sign up for our newsletter as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. Well, again, one last thank you to everyone. Thank you, Annie, for doing all of the visuals, and also for facilitating the Q&A. The intro music that we had was by a musician in our extended Angels Gate community, Adam Gaxiola. So thank you to them for letting us to continue to use his music for the intro. And thank you again to Ben and Jynx. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. Have a great rest of your evening. Stay in touch with us at angelsgateart.org and have a great rest of your night. Thank you, everyone.